Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kim McQuay, and from my ordinary base in Washington, D.C., and from the wilds of Ontario today, I lead the Asia Foundation's team of technical specialists in our core program areas. I've also been privileged to serve as a member of the Foundation's Pacific Islands Task Force, who was appointed by our President, David Arnold, to guide our increased engagement in the region. My colleagues and I are delighted that you could join us virtually for today's session on addressing COVID-related challenges facing the Pacific Islands. We'll get started formally in a couple of minutes, but in the meantime, we invite you to introduce yourself by name and organizational affiliation in the chat space. We're pleased to have a variety of organizations represented today, a testament to the increasing attention that the Pacific Islands attracts. Our session format will include a brief introduction by me, then presentations by our four speakers, and then a question and answer session. And for the Q&A, we'll be taking questions via the Q&A channel located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You're welcome to pose questions generally or direct them to individual speakers, and we'll do our best to direct those questions or to cluster those raised on related themes. Our Zoom platform includes accessibility features on which we'll post details in the chat space momentarily to ensure full inclusive access by all participants. Just pause for about 30 seconds longer just to let a few other people join, and we'll get started. So before I introduce our speakers, a brief word on the Asia Foundation's expanded engagement in the Pacific Islands. I say expanded because while we're preparing to reestablish the regional operating presence in Suva, Fiji, the Foundation has a long history of engagement in the region that has continued in different forms over 4 decades. Our engagement began in the 1980s with offshore programming, and then through the first half of the 1990s, we operated a full representative office in Suva and a regional program that spanned the Foundation's core program areas. For example, we introduced a Pacific Island Fellows program that brought young Foreign Service officers to Washington, D.C. for training and short-term internships with U.S. Congress. One program participant went on to serve as Fiji's first ambassador to the U.S. We've maintained contact with several Pacific Island Fellows who enjoyed distinguished foreign service careers. Our work also included parliamentary development programs in Fiji and PNG, judicial training, and support for women's rights organizations. We closed our Suva office in 1995. That same year, we began a 19-year, 14-country program funded by USAID's Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. That program provided training to over 7,000 people and dramatically strengthened disaster management capacity at multiple levels throughout the Pacific Islands. Then from 2002 to 2009, we also ran a regional USAID program on counter-trafficking and violence against women. Since then, we've engaged in select program activities, including election observation, technology, and through our Books for Asia program, printed book donations in partnership with the US Embassy in Fiji. Today's presentations will focus on several important development themes to which the COVID-19 pandemic has added significant challenges. You received the formal bios of our speakers with your invitations. I'll introduce them very briefly as a group, with each speaker then handing off to the next. We'll hear first from Sandra Crossar, our new Director of Pacific Island Programs. Sandra joined the Foundation in the autumn of 2020, bringing years of experience with Australian DFAT in the Pacific region, together with broader expertise in governance, conflict, and women and gender. Sandra is presently working from her base in Canberra, but will relocate to Suva with the signing of our MOU and the easing of COVID travel restrictions, both of those soon, we hope. Today, she'll be providing an overview of the context and rising geostrategic significance of the Pacific Islands, the broad implications of the COVID pandemic, and our key strategic program priorities. We'll next hear from John Carr, our Senior Director of Technology Programs. John is a veteran of multiple roles with the Foundation. For the last several years, he's led our technology work in some exciting new directions, including several Pacific Island components. Today, John will speak about the COVID-19 infodemic in the Pacific and the risks that it poses to pandemic response and recovery efforts going forward. John will be followed by Dr. Malika Sobe, our Suva-based program manager, who brings years of experience on environment, climate, and other issues and deep connections across the region. Malika will speak to the challenges that the COVID pandemic poses for a region that's already extremely vulnerable to climate change, as well as issues of regional sovereignty and some key climate response measures in the COVID context. And then finally, we'll hear from Dr. Ellen Bakusi, our Senior Advisor and former Deputy and Acting Director of Governance Programs. Ellen recently completed a study on COVID-19 and future of work for women in the Pacific, and she'll be sharing these key findings and recommendations of the study this afternoon. So with this brief welcome and introductions, I'm delighted to invite Sandra to lead us off.
Thanks, Kim. I'm delighted to be with you today. I'm speaking to you from Ngunnawal country, and I acknowledge their special relationship with the land, their role as custodians, and the leaders of the First Peoples past, present, and emerging. So why are we talking about the Pacific Islands? Well, it's become a proxy again for larger geostrategic interactions. It's rich in resources with mostly open democracies and markets, located between globally dominant and rising middle-income economies and security interests. The region has enduring relationships with a range of countries, including Australia, New Zealand, the US, Japan. It also has long-standing engagement with China, who's the largest trader across the region, both in terms of imports and exports. It's not a new trading partner, however, there is a marked and significant increase over the recent decade. The countries that I mentioned by name are also the top donors. There are, of course, many other countries operating in the region with established and new interests in trade, development, diplomacy, and security. The Pacific Ocean represents 36% of the Earth's surface, which is a partial explanation of why the Pacific Island countries prefer to be known as large ocean states rather than small island states. PNG, of course, is the exception because it has significant land mass. Approximately 56% of the 12 million population are under the age of 26, presenting opportunities and challenges as that bulge moves through. The youth and women's empowerment is progressing with pre-COVID trends showing positive trajectories for health and education, however, moving much more slowly on decision-making and leadership. Less than 1% of national budgets are allocated to gender equality or women's empowerment efforts. And gender-based violence is a shadow epidemic with countries' prevalence ranging from 40 to over 60%, and these are the pre-COVID trends. Pacific Islands are amongst the most vulnerable in the world to the effects of climate change and disasters, and Malika will speak about climate change a bit later on. Non-communicable diseases plague the Pacific Islands. In March 2021, Fiji's top surgeon reported that there was one diabetes-related amputation every 12 hours, creating hundreds of disabilities every year, and these diseases are preventable. So it's a complex region, and these are the pre-COVID structural challenges that are amplified in the current context. So moving on to the next slide. The pandemic has hit the Pacific Island regions hard. The strict border controls, which has protected the populations to date, have also, because they have a high vulnerability due to the levels of NCDs, which I mentioned earlier. Many health systems will struggle to respond to the outbreaks. This is well recognized, as they do in many countries, and we're seeing this currently playing out in Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Tourism-dependent countries such as Palau, Vanuatu, and Fiji are struggling, and vaccines are an essential factor in reopening the borders. However, supply and demand is easily disrupted, presenting a possible new geostrategic flashpoint. ADB analysis shows that the region is expected to recover and grow by 1.3% in 2021, but this is contingent on how quickly travel and trade restrictions are lifted. And this is, compare this with over 5% for Asia, so it's not a rapid bounce back, and this was pre the community transmission cases in Fiji just recently. Food security is a real concern. The reliance on manufactured and imported foods is linked to the surge in NCDs. And with COVID, many are now experiencing hunger as well as nutrition challenges due to restricted incomes, commodity price increases, and limited imports. Those with access to land are returning to gardening, but not everyone has access to land, and government and NGOs have increased support to address these. We're seeing a rapid increase in gender-based violence in frequency, intensity, and in new cases. The Fiji Women's Crisis Center reported a 300% increase in calls to their helpline during the first weeks of the current lockdown. And this is already on top. Ellen's going to talk about jobs. Children's literacy is being disrupted, and there's increasing attention to what this will mean for development prospects. While cyber connectivity is increasing, access to computers, smartphones, the internet is still limited and in high demand, and undersea cables are connecting up the Pacific, and this is escalating. COVID is actually a critical juncture, and it's led to much innovation and workarounds, the development of online services, social media messaging with positives and negatives, the valuing of local leadership and addressing disaster and humanitarian events, increased voter attention to the provision of government services, and a focus on the blue-green economy, which is led and managed by the Pacific Islands. We also need to be mindful that the Pacific Island countries don't lack agency in the unfolding geopolitical competition. They are able to negotiate and navigate political tensions. They are able to renegotiate loans and maintain independence in global arenas despite debt arrangements. So moving on to the next slide. TAF has a long-standing program, as Kim mentioned, in the Pacific Islands, but we have been continuing with some work in the past years, and most recently this has been on the infodemic and the future of work, which we're delighted to be able to speak with you today about. We're also in the process of resuming a physical presence and expanding our activities and research interests. And as we re-establish, we're listening to a range of views, looking for local reforms, respecting local agency, amplifying local voices and knowledge, and learning from the past. So based on our history, our interests, and our approach, our work focuses on 5 initial principles, which are aligned with TAF's 2025 strategic priority areas. And these are supporting Pacific solutions to Pacific challenges, inclusive climate action, amplifying women's agency and decision-making, leveraging technology for growth, and investing in evidence that will inform public policy. Moving on to the next slide. So we're setting up a mix of short-term responses to COVID as well as longer-term resilience activities and research. And of course, we're working in coalitions. We're supporting the already well-established Shifting the Power Coalition, which is made up of 12 women-led civil society organizations and the Pacific Disability Forum, working with a network of over 100,000 Pacific women to shape inclusive policy, rapid responses, and leadership on natural disasters, climate change, and the pandemic. We're continuing to put brand new books into the hands of students, educators, and readers, and we're expanding our Let's Read program to create new Pacific content stories for children ages 3 to 8. So this is a fantastic way to support children's love of reading, curiosity, language skills, and education pathways. And there is much excitement and interest in the Pacific about this program. Our first 2 book labs will be working with creatives and people living with disabilities, developing stories that engage children in inclusive climate action and oceans management. On the future of work, we're extending our analysis to look also into issues faced by older women. We're working with a Fiji NGO to build practical STEM skill sets for women and girls in the community to measure changes to their environment due to gravel extraction. And we're looking to opportunities to enhance Pacific-wide STEM networking, green business standards and capabilities, behavior change innovations to address non-communicable diseases, research and evidence to support the Pacific Island countries in making informed choices about investments. And of course, we're interested in supporting ICT capabilities. So it's quite a lot we're interested in, but it's a glimpse into some of the work that we're progressing. I'm now going to hand over to John Carr to speak about the work his team has been leading. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandra. My name is John Carr. I'm the Senior Director for Technology Programs at the Asia Foundation. And I lead a number of programs across the region supporting our work in the field of technology and where we can use technology more effectively, and also address some of the challenges that we see arising in the region as a result of its introduction. So I think maybe we'll focus on that second part during this talk. One of our main focuses is on information disorder. And what we mean by that is it's an array of challenges that come about as the information space and ecosystems change. They're transforming now as people get information from new sources. It's affecting local communities. It's becoming a dimension of local conflict, also making it very difficult for governments to achieve policy objectives. So since early 2020, we've been looking at issues in the Pacific region in light of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And while we all acknowledge the real central importance of technology to promoting development outcomes, we've also seen some challenges. One of the biggest challenges is that traditional mechanisms of discourse, how we exchange information and ideas, has been changed significantly in many parts of the world, and it's creeping into the Pacific region. That's changed a lot. People get on social media platforms and share information in new ways, and sources of news and information have also changed, how we obtain new information. So many suspect that this misinformation spreading around the world is due to these kind of system-wide changes. So with that in mind, that's what we began our research and focus in the Pacific on. Maybe we can move to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit about our research. The Asia Foundation in early 2020 convened an advisory group of policymakers, experts, academics in the Pacific region from a number of Pacific Island economies to begin a dialogue on what we expected to be some of the biggest challenges facing the region as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We also conducted a number of apologies for the sirens working from home. We also conducted a number of public opinion surveys in the region in Fiji, Vanuatu, and Papua New Guinea to gauge how people are getting information about COVID-19 and what they think about some of the big trends. We also conducted research on social media platforms, specifically on Facebook, looking at some of the big picture issues that we're seeing as far as discourse online. So now I think I want to highlight that this research was taking place last year, and we've seen a lot of changes since then. But some of the findings are really interesting. It's actually somewhat counterintuitive. Misinformation about COVID-19 present in Fiji, for example, but among the general public, belief that the pandemic is a kind of a hoax was kind of low. Only 6% of respondents in the survey believed that the virus was a hoax. So that's kind of actually encouraging. Papua New Guinea, less so. They're less likely to be concerned about the pandemic or believe in its validity. And in Vanuatu, the belief that the pandemic is a hoax was again low. So there's some encouraging trends and then also some troubling ones last year. If you dig a little deeper, you'll see that the characteristics of misinformation challenges were there in plain sight. A large number of people rely on Facebook for their news in the Pacific region now. And this is a twin challenge that goes along with some of the weaknesses in the local media ecosystems. So news information sources in the Pacific are not strong. So a lot of news and information has to come from the outside, and then it's oftentimes distributed and disseminated on social media platforms. And as a result, governments have faced difficulties tracking and responding to misinformation and hoaxes online. And this is a range of issues, not just COVID-19 challenges. Now, since our survey was administered, we've seen a number of things happen. The amount of misinformation online in local communities has increased, and homegrown content that's misleading has also increased. In Fiji, for example, there was just some stories on how TikTok users were spreading misinformation on COVID-19 and the vaccine just by creating local content and distributing it within their networks. And then COVID infection rates obviously have increased quite significantly in the region. So what do we see? We see Pacific social media users are exposed to many of the same false rumors and conspiracy theories that we all see in the global community. And an interesting dimension of this is once online, that information spreads quickly into local communities and local contexts. And one really interesting example from our survey last year was that fear of 5G networks was noted as significant in certain contexts, even though there are no 5G networks in the Pacific. So that gives you a sense of where some of these rumors and and misleading stories are coming from. So maybe we can go to the next slide and talk about, why this is happening. So first of all, how has this really come to be? First of all, large networks are oftentimes very challenging to manage, and traditionally local communities have depended upon smaller networks of trusted individuals and gatekeepers to manage information flows. So I want to stress that we think what's happening in the region and around the world, particularly in Asia Pacific where we work, is that the structure of the information space, the architecture of how people gather information and share it, is going through a system-wide transformation. So the networks are enlarging, they're growing, the connections are growing, people can connect with millions and millions of people, and some troubling issues emerge. One, connected individuals in these networks who are highly regarded are often influencing people by evoking emotional responses. A lot of passion goes into some of these influencers. And that often kind of obscures the sources for accurate information. It's not always the case that people are drawn to gatekeepers and leaders with accurate information. It's rather more sensational information. And also this idea of the transforming networks and transforming ecosystems is this idea of the speed at which information is transmitted. Oftentimes, traditional networks are very noisy. They're slower. It's harder to get information through the system, but when you have a globally connected community, lies go around the world instantly. It's frictionless. People can exchange false information quickly with no fact checking. It's just so quick that it's hard to get ahead of the lies. And then finally, on platforms, the systems that aggregate content and push it out to communities is based on algorithmic systems that have been built by the platforms to monetize engagement rather than to support healthy exchange of information. So what can be done about this? Maybe we can move to the next slide. The Asia Foundation is now working with our partners to look at how we can address this challenge with government partners, particularly in Fiji and Papua New Guinea specifically, looking at how we can improve the government capacity to respond to information disorder challenges. There's a whole host of issues there we can talk about. We're looking at new ways to bring together stakeholders to communicate and share information and to try to be advocates for an objective truth as best as we can. We're looking at how we can encourage local communities, particularly led by policymakers, to engage platforms in the region more effectively. That's particularly Facebook. How can we strengthen engagement between the private sector providers of these services and the local communities? And then finally, the issue of enhancing digital literacy within local communities is essential, and it's another area of interest for the Asia Foundation, which we're working on. I'm happy to answer more questions as we go, but I believe my time is up. So happy to answer questions as we go through this. Thank you.
Greetings from Fiji, everyone. My name is Malika. Let me start again. Greetings from Fiji. My name is Malika Sobi, and I'm the Program Manager for the Pacific Islands Office. I'll be speaking on three main issues related to climate change and the COVID-19 pandemic. But before I do, please allow me to set the context, particularly for those of you who may not be too familiar with the region. This first slide will help to explain why the new regional framework is called the Blue Pacific Continent Strategy. Yes, the island countries are indeed very small, remote from major markets, heavily dependent on development assistance, and yes, we're extremely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. However, the islands do have jurisdiction over a vast area of the Pacific Ocean, thus the Blue Continent. It's also home to the largest tuna fishery in the world, whose economic returns to the region went from US 60 million to 500 million, US 60 million in 2010 to 500 million at the end of 2019. The next slide shows the diversity of people in the Pacific. Many are often surprised at the cultural diversity here, and this slide is simply a snapshot of a few of the ethnicities in the region. So just very briefly, we have the Marshallese couple from the North Pacific, going clockwise. You have Tongans in the South Pacific. You have two Kiribati ladies from the Central Pacific, two men from PNG. Of course, PNG is the largest of the Pacific Island countries with 8 million inhabitants and 800 languages. A group of ladies from Vanuatu that has a population of 300,000 and 120 languages, and the Samoan gentleman with his granddaughter. But as the next slide shows, despite this huge cultural diversity, we share three features that I've highlighted there. The ocean is a part of the geography of all countries. It's a part of our culture, and we share the ocean's resources. The 2050 Blue Pacific Continent Strategy places the Pacific Ocean at the heart of all policies, ensuring that policy aspirations keep ocean health and climate change impacts front and center. Even more critical with the COVID pandemic that we're struggling with at the moment in the region. The strategy is specific about strategic security, the resources provided by the Pacific Ocean, and how it's incumbent on the leaders to manage resources and therefore the health of the ocean. The strategy sets out the priorities for the region as decided by the region. Hopefully other countries will respond positively and collaboratively. The next slide shows the impact of severe tropical cyclone Winston on mangroves on the northern coast of the island where I live. TC Winston was the most powerful system to make landfall in the Southern Hemisphere. The region has had 4 Category 5 cyclones in the last 6 years, 2 striking Vanuatu and 2 Fiji. In fact, in Fiji, since the borders closed in March 2020, causing the loss of 115,000 jobs due to the collapse of the tourism industry, the country's had to further endure 3 cyclones over a 10-month period, one of them being another Category 5 system. Interestingly, food security is always mentioned as a climate change concern and largely for the rural population, but it's actually taken on a new twist with COVID. Food security is now in urban areas where poverty has increased significantly due to job losses. Small and medium enterprises have shut shop, and it's driven an additional 15 to 20% of the population below the poverty line, in addition to the 30% that already lived below the poverty line pre-COVID. The job losses in town have also caused a migration from urban areas back to the rural areas because many have chosen to go back to their villages to cut down on costs and to plant their own food. But this has given rise to an increase in land conflicts. Water security continues to be an issue, and severe droughts have struck the atoll nations of Kiribati, Tuvalu, and Federated States of Micronesia in 2016 and 2020, with the intense El Nino events. The relocation of communities has been the result of consecutive natural disasters, which takes me to the next slide. The importance of engaging communities in climate responses. And there's really just 2 points that I'd like to highlight. One is that 95% of the land in Pacific Island countries is under some form of customary ownership. And the ownership of land can be a particularly sensitive issue to navigate when communities need to be relocated for their own safety. Which brings me to the last slide that I'd like to show. This is an example of the complexities of relocation due to the impacts of climate change, which have been further aggravated by the economic fallout from COVID. TUKURAKI is a village in the highlands of the island in which I live. It's a poster child of resilient communities. The village was hit by a major landslide in 2012 after intense rainfall. In fact, a family of 4 were buried alive in their house, and the authorities gave the villagers 8 hours to evacuate the village site for their own safety. But because of their deep ties to the ancestral land, some chose to go back and rebuild temporary structures. 11 months later, Cyclone Evan struck, damaging their homes again and destroying their crops. But again, they chose to return to the old village site to rebuild, but only to be hit by severe tropical cyclone Winston in 2016, which caused further devastation that you can then see on the picture on the left-hand side. Some of the villagers fled to the caves where they lived for a time, but the government identified TUKURAKI as a village that needed to be relocated permanently for their safety and well-being. So an alternative site was found on the land deemed safe from geohazards. The new site belonged to another landowning clan from the same district. A donor was found, and a regional agency, the Pacific Community, took the lead in building the new TUKURAKI village, as seen on the right-hand side. The relocation was led by the community and the government. Donors set them up with income-generating activities like beehives and fish ponds. But 3 years later, COVID came to Fiji. Villagers are now finding it very difficult to get their produce to market. Transport fees are high, and because of the depressed economy, there's not enough income made to cover costs. So half of the houses that you see on the right-hand side are now lying vacant, with the occupants choosing to move to town to be closer to market and the other facilities. The donor had good intentions, the implementing partners certainly did their part, but this case study just proves that the relocation of vulnerable communities due to climate change impacts is still very much a work in progress. Thank you for your attention. I'd now like to introduce Ellen, who will talk about her research on the future of work for women in the region.
Thank you, Malika. My colleagues have described the range of challenges that people in the Pacific are facing in the context of COVID-19. The impacts of COVID are layered upon existing vulnerabilities of workers in the region, including to climate change, as Malika has just described, and to the uptake of 4IR technologies, as John finds in his research. Given the impacts of the pandemic on women's employment in particular, the Asia Foundation's Gender Equality and Women's Empowerment Program commissioned a report on the future of work for women. I'm going to present the results of that research today. And Sandra's team has also begun new research working with Fiji women's rights movement, looking at the impacts on older women in particular. Next slide, please. I'd like to begin with an overview of labor force challenges in the Pacific. Across the Pacific, there are pronounced gender disparities in labor market participation and wages, as well as the types of work that women and men perform. 1/4 of the workforce is in vulnerable employment, primarily due to the large number of workers who engage in subsistence agriculture. Women are overwhelmingly employed in the informal economy, and they have little income security and no social protections in most cases. Unemployment is high across the region, particularly among youth and young women. Caring duties are also a significant factor, with women the primary household carers in the Pacific, spending more than 3 times as many hours per day as men on unpaid care work. And this has a huge impact on their labor force participation. In Fiji, 71% of non-working women cited household work as the primary reason for not participating in the labor force. And that data is actually from 2019 prior to COVID, so the numbers have only gone up. Sandra mentioned the high rates of gender-based violence, and in addition to the profound psychological effects of GBV, it also has a pronounced impact on labor force participation. A 2019 study of GBV's impact on the workplace in Solomon Islands found that 1 in 3 employees surveyed had experienced domestic or sexual violence in the previous 12 months, and that this violence significantly impacted their ability to get to work, to stay at work, and how they felt while they were at work. There's also a skills mismatch in the Pacific, with an overabundance of unskilled workers at the same time as shortages of workers who have technical, managerial, and professional skills that are needed locally. So as a result, you actually have large numbers of skilled workers coming in from other countries, particularly India and the Philippines, to fill technical and managerial positions despite the high unemployment locally. And at the same time, you have thousands of workers each year leaving the Pacific to go to Australia and New Zealand through regulated labor migration schemes. And this migration is actually an outlet for the oversupply of some of these low-skilled workers, and several of the Pacific governments have put in place policies and programs that support migrants to go to Australia and New Zealand in this way. Women are underrepresented in STEM education and employment, and they also have lower access to technology and lower levels of facility with technology. The ADB, ILO, and others have warned that without proactive measures to bring more women into STEM training, most women will be excluded from emerging opportunities in the green economy, as well as other technology-driven fields. Next slide, please. I'd like to turn now to emerging opportunities for women's employment in the region. Let's look first at job creation in the green economy. Climate change threatens large numbers of jobs in agriculture, fishing, and tourism, where most workers in the region are employed. But at the same time, innovative adaptation and mitigation measures are creating new types of employment that can improve resource efficiency and resilience. And these include green jobs in the areas of food production, including organic farming, renewable energy, green building, and recycling. It's important to note that most innovation is actually taking place in high-income countries. So Pacific Island countries need to rely on technology transfer, and they have to ensure upskilling of the local workforce to ensure that their workers have the ability to take on these jobs as they're created. Agriculture should be an important focus for skilling, as it's the largest employer in the region and a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. And the region also already has success with green agriculture. Niche high-value crops such as coconut, vanilla, spices have already demonstrated this success. In the area of green building, new jobs can be created in the construction of climate-resilient houses and infrastructure. I was thinking about this as Malika was speaking. And renewable energy jobs around, for instance, the installation and maintenance of solar panels. Looking at localization, improving the prospects for local workers to access the higher level technical and professional positions that are currently held by foreigners in the region requires training that is aligned with labor market needs, particularly within growth industries such as tourism, mining, and construction. Labor migration is also an opportunity in the immediate and longer term. There is significant overseas demand for workers in the areas of aged care, agriculture, health, tourism, and hospitality in Australia and New Zealand. And these offer important opportunities for lower skilled women from the Pacific. The jobs provide needed income immediately, as well as remittances for families. And in the longer term, because these are temporary schemes, the skills that women gain as they work overseas can be used for higher level employment when they return to the Pacific. This is both in terms of technical skills they gain and soft skills that can be put to use for management or entrepreneurship. Final slide, please. I'd now like to look at some of the approaches that we can use to increase women's employment in the region. First is targeted skills development. It's essential that women are provided with technical skills in the areas of projected employment creation, particularly sustainable agriculture and fishing, and green design and building. ICT skills are necessary to support employment across all industries, particularly in the wake of COVID and the move online. Where possible, policymakers should identify areas of overlap between domestic and overseas demand, for instance, in construction, healthcare, and tourism. Doing so will enable Pacific workers who train for overseas migration to ultimately bring these technical and professional skills back to the Pacific. This can both improve their own local job prospects and also potentially allow them to create new businesses that would employ and transfer skills to the local workforce. It's also essential to deepen linkages between education and industry to ensure that training is aligned with labor market needs, for instance, through industry input into curricula, and that opportunities are created for on-the-job training and pathways to formal employment. To increase the number of women in STEM or entering STEM education and employment, programs can consider addressing financial barriers to education, providing childcare for women while they're upskilling, conducting employer socialization about women's contributions to fields that are traditionally majority male, and establishing apprenticeship programs and hiring incentives that help employers bring women directly into these sorts of positions. Finally, governments can consider policies that incentivize businesses to fill available jobs with local workers rather than hiring from abroad, and invest in returning migrants through incentive programs that provide financial support and entrepreneurship training for those migrants who return and who want to start businesses in the Pacific, particularly in industries where there's local needs, such as construction and healthcare. And in this way, the skills gained overseas can be captured locally, and returning migrants can contribute to job creation at home. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellen, and for our three presenters who preceded. Those were great presentations. I am watching now the question and answer, and we've got one there, but just while we're waiting for others to put questions up, I'm just going to raise a couple of questions with our participants. And Sandra, the first one is for you, and as you're keenly aware, Civil society figures prominently in the work of the Asia Foundation across all of our work in Asia. And I know that you have both an interest and a background in civil society in the Pacific. And I wonder if you could say a word about the role of civil society in the Pacific, particularly in response to the COVID pandemic and some of these issues that we've heard across all of our presentations, and if there are particular things that Pacific Island civil society would benefit from in order to fill that role more successfully going forward.
Thanks, Kim. Yes, so civil society in the Pacific, they do quite a lot of service delivery where government aren't able to reach out into the communities. So they also are an important conduit between the communities and the government and vice versa. So they relay voices and amplify them and also send messages back into the community. They're really quite important in shaping policies and public debate because of that transmission of information, because they're tapped into the communities and they're able to present what those needs are. They also can focus attention on specific issues that may have been overlooked in government service delivery. So they're really important there. And there's positives and negatives in civil society organization. They're not just a watchdog on government services. They actually are, they're a viable part of that social contract that's operating across the region. And many, of course, of the civil society organizations are linked with faith-based organizations, being like very, very high Christian communities across the region. So to operate really in the COVID situations, I think there needs to be a recognition that they have a real role to play. They're not just there as service delivery, they're there to amplify needs, they're there to voice concerns and so forth. And what we can do is really support their own agency, they recognize the leadership that they're already exhibiting and getting behind those local reform efforts. They're tapped into their communities and their governments, they know their context. One thing that we could do that would really address some issues though is not pursue competitive funding mechanisms. I think the funding mechanisms where they all have to scramble and put together proposals and compete against each other actually undermines collaborative efforts working across CSOs as a group. And it also can distort their missions in the service of, delivering goods and services, and also amplifying particular issues. Also, the last thing I'd like to say actually about working with civil societies is that there is an allowance of difference. Like the civil society is allowed to have different views to each other. It's not like one homogeneous mass. And civil society has a really important role in the contestation of ideas in the region, holding those public dialogues, discussing those ideas amongst themselves, and also around accountability. So that big demand for governance processes. So I think I'd like to leave it there. There's a real role, we need to recognize what that is and work with them on their agenda and their needs. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you, Sandra. We're getting some questions now in the Q&A space. I'm going to direct the first one to John and Michelle Foster. John flags your reference to the need for further efforts to build the capacity of local, presumably digital media, to explore new formats, partnerships, and business models. And if you could say a broader word about that, how that would happen, and whether there's any specific countries or markets that you would see as a priority in that regard.
Sure, Kim. Well, I think one of the challenges for all media around the world is how to compete with online platforms that provide information essentially for free. And so one of the problems that people encounter when they get online, I think, and consume news today is that they often see their personal feeds populated by a whole array of different types of content, all of which look the same. So, you see a news item from one source that's not trustable, really, I think, and you see something from, say, one that you might consider reputable, like the New York Times, and they look very similar. It's very hard to tell the difference if you're not a sophisticated news consumer. So part of this, I think, is perhaps working with local media to strengthen their capacity to do local reporting. That's one piece. to give people more local information in new ways, and then to strengthen the brand and the concept of trusted media in the Pacific region. So there's kind of a marketing dimension to that. And I think then finally, helping local media develop the capacity to raise the visibility of their content online is perhaps another piece of that puzzle, because I think what we see now is competition between a global network that basically hoovers up information from across the internet and essentially gives it to users for free by monetizing their engagement, which completely squeezes out or almost completely squeezes out, traditional competitive media, which have always tried in many cases to be gatekeepers of factual and fact-checked information. So there's this kind of diffusion that's happening, and what we probably need to do is look at how we can enhance the media sectors in the Pacific in new ways so that they can be more competitive in this environment. Otherwise, they will probably not be long for this earth. So.
Thanks, John. The next question comes from John Brandon. John asks whether there's any statistics on how much Pacific Island countries rely on foreign remittances from nationals who are working in Australia, New Zealand, or other countries. And I think John's question is especially pertinent in the context of COVID because of some of the disruptions that it's made globally for remittance, labor, and returnees. And Ellen, I'm going to raise that question with you because I know this is an issue of interest, but if you haven't encountered this particular issue, then maybe other panelists can address it as well too, but maybe Ellen, you first.
I see Sandra has her hand up, so I'll just say briefly, the World Bank does collect this data globally, and you can match up the sending country to the recipient country, and there's an Excel sheet online that I can share with you after. But the other thing I would say is that the remittances have been increasing during COVID, and I just read an article actually this morning about how some of the local fintech companies working in Australia are beginning to compete in lowering their rates and finding ways to facilitate that these migrants use, their channels to send remittances home, because there's a lot of money at stake. And currently, most people are using Western Union, and they pay, I think, $6 up front for every transaction, and it's among the highest routes for sending money in the world. I'll let Sandra continue.
Great, thanks, Ellen. Sandra?
Yeah, remittances. So, for example, in Tonga, the remittances pre-COVID were 40.7% of total GDP. They're one of the highest remittance countries in the region. It was predicted due to COVID that it would fall by around 19.7%. However, as Ellen mentioned, the remittances haven't fallen away, and that's mainly to do with the transmission of the remittances. People are no longer taking money over because the borders are locked. Often, people would take their under $10,000 and be able to just take it in person and deliver it. And they would do this because the amounts were small, and also because of the significant costs of transmitting it through formal gateways. The rates for transmission in some countries were up to 40%, which is, a phenomenal amount of money in administrative and rates on remittances going into the country. So this is looping back then. This is the importance of developing ICT skills, because what we're seeing, the increase is due to people transmitting money over the internet and via these services rather than taking it in person. Malika.
I just add, Kim, that in 2020, there were new records set in remittances in Fiji, which received some 600 million Fijian in remittances, which would be about 300 million US in 2020. And this is largely because of COVID and extended family sending money to their family members here. If it weren't for those foreign remittances, there'd be a lot more people starting now.
Thank you, Malika. Just while we wait for more questions from participants, I'm going to raise a question with John. And the Asia Foundation, we often describe ourselves as an organization that's fundamentally interested in governance. And if you scratch the surface of almost any program area in which you work, you will find a governance issue in response. And John, I'd be delighted to hear from you about how the phenomenon of information disorder in the Pacific is affecting governance.
Well, thanks, Kim. I think, as I mentioned in the presentation, there's a sense, at least at the Asia Foundation and in certain circles, that what we call sort of the information architecture or the ecosystems for information are going through a kind of system-wide transformation, meaning everyone gets their news from news sources now. And then also everyone, generally speaking, tends to engage in civic discussions online in new ways. So this whole, 25 years ago, 30 years ago, globally, things were quite different as far as how we got our information and how we engaged with that information and how we related to government. The government is also having that same problem, which is to say that information disorder is making it difficult for governments to achieve policy objectives. I would just cite very specifically vaccine initiatives, but this goes for a whole range of different issues where trust and information sharing and dissemination of factual information is essential to citizens' engagement with government and vice versa. So we need to be looking at ways to engage with government partners to enhance their capacity to adjust to this new information environment because of the problems of information disorder. So what I mean by that is there are problems within governments as far as interagency coordination so that one group knows what the other is doing vis-a-vis misinformation challenges. And I'll just give one example. In Fiji, for example, the national police often receive lots of complaints about problems that citizens see on the internet. A whole range of different reports and complaints are received by the police, and the police really just don't know how to deal with this because it's partly not a policing matter. It's hard to do enforcement on some of this stuff. But the other problem is they don't know where to send these reports. And the broader bureaucracy isn't managing these challenges very well. So it's very hard for governments to quickly respond to misinformation online, which, as I said in my presentation, spreads rapidly before fact-checking can take place. And that's just one example of the many challenges that governments will face going forward as we see these changes ripple around the world. The whole universe of how we interact with information has changed. So governments have to also change. And that's, I think, one of the big governance challenges in the Pacific and more broadly in the Asia Pacific region.
Thanks very much, John. That's fascinating. The next question comes from Atul Kaushik, and it's an interesting one for the Pacific because it raises an area where the Asia Foundation has been very active in Timor-Leste and Sri Lanka and other countries in which we work. And I would love to put this question out to our Pacific specialist, and that is what kind of facilities are available currently to address any psychosocial care needs that arise out of the pandemic, and again, whether civil society organizations play an active role in that space. So maybe I can pass that first to Sandra, and Malika, you may have something to add about that as well too.
Thank you. Yes, there is a rising need and interest in providing psychosocial care, particularly with the humanitarian supporters. I know the Red Cross have been very, very active in advocating for psychosocial care to be incorporated into national disaster response programs and planning. So there is that element there. There's quite a lot of psychosocial care also being provided through the crisis centers, the women and children crisis centers, to address the horrendous numbers of domestic violence incidences across the region. So there are those psychosocial services already being provided. So they're also being provided by CSOs, such as I said, the Red Cross, but also through government health services. And with the rise of telehealth in the region, I think we'll see an increase in supply and also demand in those care needs.
Great, thank you, Sandra. Malika, would you like to add any word on that?
Just to elaborate on what Sandra said about CSOs being very prominent in that field, we've got Empower Pacific. They've been doing a lot of counseling, and it's a real issue now with COVID and the the economic fallout from COVID and the job losses, there is a significant rise in mental health issues, particularly in this country where tourism was such a big employer.
Sorry about that. My Teams channel went astray there just for a moment. The next question I have is for Ellen. And Ellen, as you well know, one of the areas that the foundation is very interested in the Pacific is the green economy. And we've seen a convergence of that with the COVID pandemic as well, too. And in the course of your research, we're wondering if you came across any successful or particularly striking programs that support Pacific women's transition to green economy employment opportunities.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. Prior to the pandemic, I had the opportunity to evaluate a program in Fiji that trained women to become construction workers and to build climate resilient housing. And the goals of the project were to, first of all, increase women's employment in green jobs, particularly in the male-dominated field of construction, where there were not many women employed at all and where there's a demand for labor currently in Fiji. And also to support community resilience through the construction of houses that can withstand Category 5 cyclones, I believe, if I remember correctly. And the project was really successful. About 3/4 of the participants, I think there were about 20 women in the program, actually found jobs in construction after the project. And it also had a huge impact on gender perceptions within the families of these women, within the communities, and even within the industry and the trainers who were training them in construction. I mean, it was pretty amazing to see the community members who were living in the communities where these women built these houses. And they were very basic houses. And so they were able to build them actually in 2 weeks. Were sort of amazed and came to see the houses and commented on how strong they were and how, you know, they didn't think that women could do this sort of work and would be strong enough to build these houses, and that they really saw within 2 weeks that they produced these amazing houses. And then one of the trainers commented that his whole sort of view of how he did construction was influenced by working with the women, because at first he was noticing that they worked much slower than he would like them to, and he thought this was a problem. And then he realized that they actually never had to pull out work and do it again because they did it right the first time and they did it slowly. And he said after working with these women for 6 months, he completely changed how he did construction himself, and he tried to be more precise and sort of slow down. And the women also became role models for others to go into construction, including younger women. So it was a pretty amazing project, and it showed the potential of, you know, bringing women into fields where they haven't been working and sort of finding these niche opportunities. I mean, from Malika's presentation, we saw that the whole community had to be moved because the houses weren't strong enough, where the community really wanted to stay in that particular location.
Great, thank you, Ellen, for sharing that anecdote. That's really fascinating. Malika, another question for you, and that is if you could say a little bit more about existing collaboration on ocean management. I think your reference to the Blue Pacific is one that has really caught a lot of attention in the last couple of years. Any examples that you might cite about striking existing collaboration or new approaches that may lay on the horizon that you would recommend that be taken up?
Can I just say that the management of coastal resources has really taken a dive since COVID, largely because there are just so many more people resorting to fishing as a means of securing protein. So there's a particular group that was set up in Fiji called Barter for Better Fiji. And so because people didn't have cash to exchange, they would exchange goods, which is the old bartering system in many island cultures anyway. But there's a huge danger in that, because every day I see posted huge amounts of fish and shellfish from the rivers, from the seas. And it would be very interesting to see what the stock abundances are like after this COVID is over, because they really are exhausting the supply from the coastal waters. And it's just because of the pressure to get food on the table. Marine protected areas, taboo areas for communities, they were touted as being the solution to declining stocks. But I believe that with the rural migration that's been happening and with the increased job losses, many of those marine protected areas would have just been opened up for fishing because people need to get food on their table. Now, there's also a question about the competing demands for tourism and fisheries. Countries make their money from the large offshore fisheries like tuna, and they make their money from fishing licenses. A few of the countries have domestic fishing fleets, but by and large, it's fishing licenses that are issued to distant water foreign fishing boats. For tourism, there's always a battle between environmental conservation and tourism bringing in top dollar. We've had some really bad cases in Fiji recently where developers have come in and done an enormous amount of destruction to reefs, and they've not paid any compensation for that. And this has always been a constant battle between the government, who sees tourism as, being the big foreign exchange earner, well, it was before it collapsed with COVID, and the need to conserve our environment. And I believe that this conflict will continue into the future. CSOs are trying their best and I think it's because there's also a disconnect between the traditional leadership and government. And it's that disconnect that's also fueled this environmental degradation to the peril of the traditional resource owners that rely on those coastal waters for their sustenance. Hope that answers that question.
Thank you very much, Malika. There was no questions yet about power failures, but I just had one, so I actually literally disappeared for about 40 seconds there. I apologize for that. No generator, it was supposed to be working. Chandra, I'm going to go back to you now with a question, and that is, there has been a lot of attention in the context of the broad geopolitical interest in the Pacific Islands about traditional donors, and maybe even some non-traditional donors, recalibrating their development assistance policies for the Pacific Islands region. You, of course, know the Australians intimately and have been looking more recently at changes in US policy. But I wonder, within both in the context of the issues that we're discussing today, but also just a little bit broadly, if you could say a word about the changing dynamics of development assistance for the region and what some of the key issues to be mindful of as those policies are implemented.
Thanks, Kim. I think what we need to be mindful of is that development and donor interests are not separated from their interests in security and trade and diplomacy. So these agendas are actually really intertwined. And what we're seeing is increased competition in the region between the more traditional security interests of the US and Australia, as per the post-World War II order, and how others who are also increasingly interested in expanding their own footprints. The region is really rich in natural resources, and so countries are becoming more and more interested in those opportunities. And I'd just like to point participants to this excellent series done by The Guardian on the Pacific plunder. If you have time, just please tap in and have a look at the excellent, it's a series of articles with some data sets around what is happening in terms of the extractives in the region. You can see there that China is one of the largest consumers of these extractives in fishing and logging. Australia takes 100% of the gold. Indonesia and logging, Malaysia, US, Korea, Japan, New Zealand, they're all interested in the extractives. And this is the rising number of extractives leaving the country is of concern to the Pacific Island countries who rely on them for their economic viability. This actually then goes back to the development aspects of it, is if these extractives are leaving the region, they're not getting the true value back into the Pacific Islands, then they're becoming more and more reliant on ODA in order to just even to roll out services. So in line with the trade interest, the new donors are also expanding their programs, and this is for strategic interests. You can see that there's been a change in Solomon Islands and Kiribati, who've moved alliances from Taiwan over to China, PRC, just recently. And this is standard diplomatic processes where people will align their security trade and other interests with their development models. So what we're really looking at is an increased opportunity, an increased field of players in the Pacific Islands, and the Pacific have acknowledged that this is leading to increased opportunities for them and the choices that they're able to make. So they're able to exercise their own agency, make their own decisions. A great example is the one that Malika mentioned before around the Nauru partnership, where the the large ocean states banded together collectively to bargain on fishing licenses and catch sizes and so forth. And this is generating quite significant revenues. What we're interested in as a joined up agenda is really about how can we assist the Pacific Island countries to make choices that by how can we provide data and evidence that will help them support their own analysis of the costs and benefits, both in the short term and in the long term. How we can establish trust relationships with the key political and business people who are committed to open democratic Pacific Islands. And also about making long-term commitments in the region that responds to the changing context and according to their greatest needs. The Pacific Islands have been upfront in saying we want people to engage with us on the climate crisis in the region. They've said it, and it's up to us to respond to that. There's also significant interest in resilient jobs and the sustainable management of their blue-green economy. So I think we are interested in helping the Pacific Island countries hold their investors, their partners, their donors to account in the region, and the region will then benefit enormously. And so I'm really super excited about the new Pacific Island Forum Blue Continent strategy. I think, as Malika pointed out, it puts it at the heart of all policy in the region. It's not just a sector off onto the side, you know, under environment. It's actually, it's front and center and at the core of all their policy going forward. This is new.
Great, thank you very much, Sandra. A question now for Ellen, and that is, Ellen, we have seen how important the circumstances and the challenges faced, particularly by women who are working in the informal sector in a number of countries. I wonder whether you could say a word about that in the context of your recent research, and particularly what steps could be taken that would most benefit women who are working in the informal sector as we move to a post-pandemic recovery phase.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen in the Pacific and around the world that informal sector workers have been the most impacted by the pandemic in terms of being, you know, the first to be let go if they were working. You know, many informal sector workers work in companies, but they don't have a formal arrangement. So they're often the first to be dismissed. For those who are doing really informal positions, they, you know, were really affected by having to stay at home and not being able to go to the market and the reduction in demand. And there was no social protection for most of these people. So, I mean, in terms of things that governments can do, first of all, in some countries, but not all, social protection measures were expanded to the entire populace, to the entire citizenry, not just to formal workers. But for instance, in Fiji, people were allowed to take an early contribution from their distribution from their provident fund, which is one of the things we had under the CARES Act here. So really having, you know, immediate cash assistance for everyone who needs it is important during the pandemic and the sorts of disasters that the Pacific Islands faces due to climate change. In terms of, you know, longer term measures, it's important that labor laws be extended to cover informal workers in places that they're not. Under international law, informal workers have most of the same rights that formal workers do, and ensuring that this is clear in the legislation can help reduce the risk of exploitative working conditions, things like non-payment of wages, and of course, child labor. And we've seen, you know, everywhere that COVID is pushing informal workers into more and more precarious positions because people need to work and they need to find some way to have an income, and they will, you know, take worse working conditions if they have to. I'm also a big proponent of supporting informal workers to be formalized. I know this is sort of a contentious issue, but recognizing that in the Pacific, the majority of workers are working informally, and so this is a huge undertaking and will take time. There are steps that can be taken to move significant numbers of workers toward the formal economy. Starting with sectors like the garment sector, where you can sort of track who's in the factories. And this is a sector where women are at risk of losing their jobs to automation anyway. So starting in targeted areas and working to formalize those positions is one step. Another step is thinking about women who actually run informal enterprises and trying to work directly with them or through business associations to think about ways to actually convince them to formalize in terms of the loans they would have access to, insurance, other benefits. And this is a win-win for the government, who then collects revenue from these businesses.
Great. Thanks very much, Ellen. I'm just monitoring the Q&A to see if there's any more participant questions, and I don't see one, so I'll just take the liberty and tyranny of the chair to ask one more, and that's for John Carr. And John, you focused today on this fascinating body of work on disinformation in the Pacific, but I know that you are also deeply involved through your work with APEC and in other quarters with digital economic prosperity. And one of the things that we've been very proud and privileged to do is to pivot a lot of our programs this last year to look particularly at the implications of the COVID pandemic for the digital economies. I wonder if you could say a brief word about the digital economy in the Pacific going forward, and just maybe highlight a couple of issues that are especially important that are outstanding and would do well to address going forward.
Sure, Kim. Well, I guess I started my brief talk highlighting the value of technology tools, and there's a range of things that can be introduced in the region as more undersea cables are installed and more connectivity options are available to people that can make social protection schemes, for example, more efficient through digital payments processing, for example. There's remote work opportunities for the Pacific. There's a new ways to connect people in the informal economy with buyers who have a willingness to pay, meaning maybe the tourism sector, and to do those transactions online using a mobile device. As long as the business environment, the policy environment in the region is conducive to that, many good things can come to be. But as I also highlighted in the presentation, there's a real challenge. And I think to restate it in a maybe different way is that we're sort of taking our evolved information foraging skills and offloading those onto algorithms that we then rely on to give us information about our world. But these algorithms, they're typically designed to maximize profitability. And there's really insufficient incentive to promote an informed, just, healthy, sustainable society. And this is a real problem because we as a society globally really haven't effectively adapted this frame to understand how this is affecting people. And there really isn't a lot of data and evidence and analysis that helps us understand what's happening in this part of the world and in that particular challenge. So Asia Foundation wants to do more of that kind of work in the Pacific so that we can understand how people access and share information, how governments interact with communities, how the civil society is engaged, how the media sector is engaged. Because along with the good things in the digital economy piece, which is going to really drive development in the region and help people access new opportunities that they never had before, and new education opportunities, new things like e-health, incredible, critical, as 5G actually does get enabled in the region. 5G will make e-health possible, and that will really help with some of the health and safety problems in the region. But we've got to do more work on some of the downside risks, because we're doing a global experiment on a population of people that includes all of us. And we don't know what's really going to come to be as a result of that. And it's transformative. It's never really, the society has never really been organized in this way before. And there isn't enough research being done on that dimension of our future. So that's something that we're focused on at the foundation.
Great, thanks, John. Now, who's afraid of 5G? John Brandon has piggybacked just a fast question onto your comments just now. And that is, John, who is laying the undersea cables? Is it a combination of different countries that are invested, and is there a competition in that space?
Certainly competition. Australia really is leading the way. There are also, obviously, many of these cables are investments by private sector companies from the United States, from Australia, from Asia, but there are also plans, and in many cases, some have already begun to be laid, sort of national education and research infrastructure for networks that connect universities globally, and will then also connect, ideally, in the not too distant future, the universities and academic institutions in the Pacific. This is already happening. The APNIC Foundation, for example, is involved in a lot of really interesting work to connect these national education networks to the Pacific. And so that will be one thing to watch carefully, because already these kinds of nonprofit or education-oriented infrastructure investments are contested at times by private sector companies that would like to own, the exclusive rights to the infrastructure for information in the Pacific. And these are alternatives to that private sector investment, government investment. So this will be an interesting time for the region. And an exciting time, and a time which will connect people who have never had access to this kind of information resource to new opportunities. But we again have to watch very carefully both the private sector challenges that are introduced through as a result of competition. They may have some downside aspects to them, and then the information challenges, where information disorder is so disruptive that it makes it impossible for governments to achieve policy objectives. So, thanks,
John. Paul Kreutzer has just raised a question that's worthy of another seminar or two, but I want to put it out there because it's an excellent question, and it's really fundamental to the thinking of the Asia Foundation and our return to the Pacific Islands from the years that we did work there, and from coming back up to speed on some of these new developments that Sandra has referred to, and that is in the context of building on the earlier governance discussion, how are traditional non-official governance networks building resilience within the communities? And I'm going to pose that question first to Malika within the context of climate resilience, and then to Sandra maybe to speak a little bit more broadly about the significance of non-traditional governance, both to the Pacific, but to the work of the Asia Foundation going forward.
I can think of three ways in which they're trying to do that. They're trying to climate-proof their communities. I see there's a big push with many of the coastal villages in planting mangroves. And so mangroves have been used as a natural infrastructure, some complementing that with seawalls, but just trying to make their communities a little bit more protected from the elements, particularly with the king tides that frequently inundate the villages these days. Secondly, they're really promoting the gardening, planting more food and making use of the land that's there. And thirdly, it's trying to change the mindset of people, not to be so dependent on government handouts. We have to try and help ourselves and not wait for the government to hand things to us. I think those are the three main ways in which the traditional leaders are really trying to promote more resilience within their communities.
Thank you, Malika. Sandra?
Thanks, that's a great question. So I'm going to talk about this one, then I'm going to go back to the cables, if that's possible. So I think, as we know, there's been years, decades of isomorphic mimicry happening across the region, where there'll be these best practice, international best practice, pieces of legislation, institutional reforms, and so forth that have happened in the region. Yet they've been done with just as an overlay on traditional governance, and the norms and the processes that actually guide how society work will interpret what those institutions, the imposed legislation and ideas how they actually work. So traditional non-official governance is actually vitally important, because despite all best efforts of these world benchmarked pieces of legislation, it's just open to interpretation. What we're seeing, though, is that a lot of the views of the traditional leaders haven't been well heeded, and COVID's actually presenting this amazing opportunity for the local leaders to be able to guide and lead their communities because we haven't had the FIFOs, the fly in, the fly out, humanitarian support. So local leadership in their communities have been stepping forward and being recognized in being able to lead and drive these changes. What we're also seeing is that there's an increase in people-to-people support in countries themselves. So in Vanuatu, we heard recently about people fundraising for ventilators. We're seeing, and Malika mentioned, people are supporting our fellow people in the community. So we're seeing more of those more traditional kiri-kiri one-talk systems being activated as well. If I can just pop back to the previous question about cables. The cables are being supplied and run through, through the US, through Australia, through New Zealand. Fiji's got one linked up with Tonga. And a lot of the focus has been around the national cable. So how are capitals being linked up? And there's policies in place to guide that. And I think we've seen, and like it being played out with, some countries wanting to supply cables, and then there's been decisions made to go with other countries' sort of cables and so forth. What we're finding, though, is that there's a gap at the subnational level. So where you would have the national levels relatively sewn up with, like-mindeds like US, Australia, and so forth, there's a lot of entry points at the subnational level that policies and decision-making allow new players to come in at that point. So it's something to be aware of. If you have a look at the research done by Dr. Amanda Watson from the Australian National University, she's doing this excellent piece of work on mapping the cables at the moment. So if you just do a quick Google of Amanda Watson, ANU, you should be able to come up with some of that work.
Great, thank you, Sandra. It was just a suggestion from one of our participants about the recording, and the session, I believe, has been recorded, and the host should be following up, I believe, with a link. But we are bumping up against our designated 90 minutes, so we're going to close out here. And I'm going to do that by first thanking our 4 participants for their thoughtful presentations. And I hope that from each of these presentations today, you have come away, among other things, with a sense of just how excited the Asia Foundation is to be expanding our work in the Pacific, and including a return to a physical regional operating base in the Pacific, as we said earlier, we hope happens soon. This is the first of what we hope will be many programs as our program in the Pacific grows. So watch this space for more invitations in future. We'll also be sure to share interesting publications of research reports and other things that we produce going forward. And then finally, I'd just like to give a big thanks to all of the participants who joined us and gave up part of their afternoon. We all live these days in the Zoom space, and it can be a little bit fatiguing sometimes. So we're really grateful to everyone for joining us. We hope that you have enjoyed the presentation as much as we've enjoyed organizing and delivering it. So we look forward to seeing you next time, and thanks to everyone. Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, and to everyone who joined and our panelists.